5,000 square cubits of floor space, 45 towering cedar columns, foundation stones that each weighed as much as a loaded truck, a single hall stretching wider than a basketball court, raised without steel, without concrete, without cranes, without one single power tool in the hands of any worker. This was the Palace of Solomon. And here is the detail that has unsettled Bible readers for 3,000 years. It was 4 times the size of the temple, 4 times bigger than the dwelling place of God himself. So you have to ask, why would the wisest king who ever lived raise his own house 4 times larger than the house of the Almighty? Was it pride creeping in? Was it the first crack in a faith that would later fail him? Or have we been asking the wrong question for 30 centuries? Here is what most people miss. The answer is not buried in theology. It is hidden in the stone. It is written in the engineering. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The year was somewhere near 960 BC. Jerusalem was a young capital perched on the hills of a young kingdom. Solomon had just finished the most ambitious sacred building project his people had ever attempted. The temple, 7 years of labor, 70,000 men carrying loads on their backs, 80,000 men cutting stone in the mountains. And when the Ark of the Covenant was finally carried into the most holy place, the glory of God came down so thick that the priests could not stand to do their work. The temple was complete, but Solomon was not finished building. 1 Kings chapter 7 opens with one short verse that has set off centuries of argument. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. 13 years, almost double the time he spent on the house of God. And when you line up the measurements side by side, the gap only grows stranger. The temple measured 60 cubits long by 20 cubits wide, roughly 1,200 square cubits of floor. The Great Hall of Solomon's palace measured 100 cubits by 50 cubits, 5,000 square cubits. More than 4 times the temple's footprint stretched across the same hilltop. Now here is something we tend to skip past. Solomon did not build this himself. He could not have. His people were shepherds and farmers and soldiers. They were good men, strong men, but they were not architects who knew how to design massive stone structures. They had no engineers who understood how to bridge open spaces that would defeat builders for the next 2,000 years. So Solomon turned north. He turned to Hiram, king of Tyre. The Phoenicians were the master builders of the ancient world. They had the timber, those legendary cedars of Lebanon. They had the ships and the sea routes to move enormous loads of material across open water. And most of all, they carried generations of building knowledge that Israel simply did not have yet. This partnership would create something the world had never seen. But before any of it could rise, Solomon's builders faced 5 problems that seemed impossible. How do you roof a space wider than a basketball court using nothing but wood? How do you light up a forest of columns so the room is not lost in shadow? How do you drag 50-ton stones uphill to a city on a mountain? How do you make 5 separate buildings work together like one living body? And the question underneath all of it, why on earth, in faith and in practice, would you build your palace 4 times larger than God's own house? Let us take them one at a time. The center of the whole complex was a structure called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 2 hands us the exact size. 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. In numbers we use today, that is roughly 45 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters tall. And those numbers created an immediate crisis. Cedar from Lebanon was the finest building material on earth in that age. Strong, fragrant, resistant to rot and to insects. Kings across the whole region emptied their treasuries to get their hands on it. But cedar, like every kind of wood, has a hard physical limit that no amount of gold can bypass. A single cedar beam cannot safely cross 22.5 meters of open air. It does not matter how thick you cut it. Physics does not bend for a king. Under its own weight plus the weight of the roof pressing down from above, a beam that long will sag in the middle. Then it cracks. Then, all at once, it fails, and the whole roof comes down on whatever stands beneath it. Engineers today confirm what the ancient builders learned the hard way, through collapse and loss. The safe distance for a timber beam in that era was about 10 to 15 cubits, maybe 12 meters if you pushed it. Solomon needed to cover 50 cubits. The math did not work. It could not work. So his builders, almost certainly those Phoenician specialists from Tyre, designed something clever. They built what we would call a forest of columns holding up the roof. The text tells us the roof rested on rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams laid across the top of them. By planting rows of heavy columns all through the interior, they broke that impossible 50-cubit span into a series of small spans, each one only 12 or 13 cubits wide. And suddenly, every beam was sitting comfortably inside the safe range of cedar. The problem dissolved. And that is exactly why the building got its name. The House of the Forest of Lebanon was not just a poetic flourish. It was a plain description of what you saw. When you walked through those doors, you were surrounded. Great cedar trunks rose all around you toward the ceiling, packed so close together that crossing the hall felt like walking through the mountain forest where those trees once grew. Scripture mentions 45 columns set in rows of 15. Some old manuscripts say 3 rows. Others say 4. Scholars have wrestled with the arithmetic for a very long time. But the engineering idea holds no matter how you count them. Spread the load. Let many pillars carry what no single beam ever could. And here's the part that gives me chills. This same solution, columns carrying a roof across a distance no beam could survive alone, would not become standard in European building until the great Gothic cathedrals rose 2,000 years later. 2,000 years. Solomon's builders worked it out in the 10th century before Christ. But solving the roof opened a brand new wound. They were nowhere near finished. 45 columns held the roof. 45 columns also threw 45 shadows. Picture it. Sunlight comes in through the doorways around the edges. The moment it enters, it slams into a wall of cedar trunks. The light scatters. Shadows pile on shadows. The deeper you walk, the darker it gets. And this was not just an unpleasant feeling. It was a genuine failure of purpose. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us this hall stored 300 large shields covered in beaten gold, and 300 smaller shields, also gold. This room was an armory and a treasury at the same time, a display of military power and national wealth, built to overwhelm foreign visitors before they ever reached the throne. But gold needs light and shadow. Gold looks like dull, tired bronze. Only when the light strikes its surface does gold catch fire with that unmistakable shine that whispers of power and riches. A dark hall full of golden shields defeats the entire point of having them. And here is the trap the builders walked into. More windows mean weaker walls. You cannot just punch holes wherever you please without putting the whole structure at risk. And windows down at eye level would be blocked anyway by the very columns holding up the roof. The answer shows up in 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 4 and 5. Window frames set in 3 rows, with light facing light in 3 tiers. This is what we would call clerestory design. Instead of cutting windows at eye level where the columns would block them, Solomon's architects set the windows high on the walls, above the tops of the pillars, up near the roof line. 3 horizontal bands of openings running the full length of the building, each band facing its match across the hall. Light poured in from above. It came down in dramatic shafts, sliding right past the forest of columns and flooding the open center of the floor, exactly where those 300 golden shields were waiting to blaze. But the windows did more than carry light. Those 3 tiers facing each other across the open air created something engineers call the chimney effect. Hot air rises in a hall packed with people, with soldiers and officials and visiting dignitaries. Body heat builds up fast. That warm air climbed naturally toward the ceiling and slipped out through the high windows. Meanwhile, cooler air was pulled in through the lower doorways, and the whole room began to breathe. Constant circulation. No machines. No fuel. Just window placement worked out by someone who understood how air moves. They built air conditioning in 960 BC, and they did it with nothing but holes in the right places. So stand in that hall for a moment. Feel the soft current of air drifting through the space. Breathe in the cedar. That sweet, sharp scent of fresh wood filling your lungs with every breath. Watch 300 golden shields catch the morning light coming down from above, glowing like a row of captured suns against dark cedar walls. This was a room built to overpower the senses of anyone who entered. The roof was solved. The light was solved. And the hardest problem had not even started yet, because everything you see standing above the ground depends entirely on what is buried beneath it. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 10 holds a detail that makes modern engineers shake their heads. The foundation was laid with great stones, costly stones, cut stones measuring 10 cubits and 8 cubits. Sit with that for a second. 10 cubits is about 4.5 meters. 8 cubits is about 3.5. These were not bricks. These were monster blocks of Jerusalem limestone, each one longer than a large vehicle parked end to end. Now do the weight in your head. Jerusalem limestone, the kind ancient builders prized for being both workable and strong, runs around 2.5 tons per cubic meter. A careful, modest estimate for a block 4.5 meters long puts the weight near 30 tons. A realistic estimate pushes it to 50 tons or more. 50 tons, the weight of a fully loaded semi-truck. Now picture moving that uphill to a city on a mountain. No wheels strong enough to bear it. No engines. No cranes. No hydraulics. Just human muscle. Simple machines. And a level of coordination that is honestly hard to imagine. And we know it could be done, because the proof is still sitting in the ground. In the tunnels beneath the western wall of Old Jerusalem. Archaeologists have measured foundation stones weighing over 500 tons. The technology was real. The only question left is how. The answer is a method called ashlar masonry. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 9 describes the work itself. Costly stones cut to measure, sawed with saws, finished smooth on every face. The side you could see and the side you never would. Ashlar construction fits stones together with such precision that they need no mortar at all. No cement. No glue. The pure weight of the blocks pressing against each other creates a stability that is held for 3,000 years and ridden out earthquake after earthquake. But the accuracy required is staggering. Every face has to be perfectly flat. Every angle has to be a true right angle. The smallest mistake, and the stones will not seat against each other. The Phoenician craftsmen even left a kind of signature, a technique called drafted margins. They carved a smooth, flat border around the edge of each visible face, leaving the center slightly raised and rough. And here is what is fascinating. That same exact mark shows up at building sites all across Solomon's kingdom. Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, the same hand, the same blueprint, the same specialists from Tyre, leaving their fingerprint across an entire nation. The moving itself was simple physics multiplied by enormous manpower. First, you quarry the stone at a site lower than Jerusalem. Second, you cut and shape the block right there at the quarry, because removing the waste before you move it saves a mountain of effort. Third, you build earthen ramps leading up toward the building site. Fourth, you roll the stone forward on wooden cylinders, grabbing each roller as it comes out the back and carrying it around to the front again. Fifth, you use levers and pivot points to ease the block into its final resting place. 1 Kings chapter 5 gives us the workforce behind all of it. 70,000 men bearing loads. 80,000 cutting stone in the mountains. 3,300 supervisors keeping it all moving. 150,000 people organized around stone. With the foundation secure, they faced the most tangled problem of all, building 5 different structures that had to function as one single living thing. Because Solomon did not need a palace. He needed something far more complicated. He needed a defense headquarters, a seat of government, a high court, a royal home, and a guest house for visiting royalty, all woven into one complex. 5 different jobs, 5 different sets of needs, one unified design. The House of the Forest of Lebanon was the armory and the treasury, which meant it needed enormous interior volume for storage and display, plus the tightest security in the kingdom for things that could never be replaced. The Hall of Pillars was a reception area and a waiting room, a covered porch 50 cubits by 30 where foreign delegations and ordinary petitioners gathered before they were allowed into the king's presence. The Hall of Judgment held the throne and served as the courtroom, which demanded very specific acoustics so the king's rulings could be heard clearly, and a design that announced absolute authority the moment you walked in. The royal residence held Solomon himself, and so it needed privacy, comfort, and protection. And finally, there was a separate palace for the daughter of Pharaoh, Solomon's Egyptian wife, which addressed both diplomatic courtesy and something more delicate. 2 Chronicles chapter 8 gives us Solomon's own reasoning. His wife could not live in the house of David, because the places the Ark of the Covenant had entered were holy. An Egyptian princess raised among many gods could not dwell in spaces that had been set apart by the presence of the living God. So she received a house of her own, a separate building, joined to the whole, yet kept distinct from the sacred. and the layout followed a quiet logic of growing privacy. The first layer, the most public, was the House of the Forest of Lebanon. This was what a foreign ambassador met first. 300 golden shields shining in shafts of high light. A forest of columns proving technical mastery beyond anything in their own land. The message needed no words. This kingdom holds wealth, power, and skill. Think very carefully before you cross us. The second layer was the buffer, the Hall of Pillars. Here the visitors waited. Here the crowds were managed. Here the tension built before the next threshold opened. The third layer, more private, was the Hall of Judgment. Cedar paneling covered every surface from the floor to the ceiling. And that was not just decoration. Wood absorbs sound. It kills the harsh echo that bare stone throws back. So when Solomon spoke his ruling, his voice carried with perfect clarity. Steady, resonant, final. And at the heart of that room stood the throne. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes it in loving detail. Ivory overlaid with pure gold. 6 steps climbing up to the seat. 12 lions. 1 standing at each end of every step. 2 more lions flanking the armrests. The text says plainly that nothing like it had ever been made for any kingdom anywhere. The fourth layer, fully private, was Solomon's own residence, tucked behind all the public spaces, wrapped in the highest security. And the fifth layer, kept diplomatically apart, was the Egyptian queen's palace. The result was an architectural body where every space did its own job while serving the whole. Public intimidation flowing into private judgment. National display opening into personal dwelling. One organism with 5 organs, each one alive. But all of this brilliance leads us straight back to the uncomfortable question, the one that has haunted faithful readers for 3,000 years. So let us look it dead in the eye. The temple took 7 years. The palace took 13. The temple covered 1,200 square cubits. The palace covered 5,000. On paper, it looks damning. Critics across the centuries have pointed at these numbers as proof that something had shifted inside Solomon. That the king who once asked God for wisdom had started to chase his own glory instead. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, noticed the gap in time. He explained the temple's faster finish as the result of divine help, which quietly suggested the palace lacked that help because it lacked that same place in God's heart. The skeptic's case almost writes itself. If Solomon truly loved God most of all, why did he pour nearly twice the years into his own house? Here is the engineering answer, and it has 3 parts. First, gathered materials. 1 Chronicles chapter 22 tells us that David spent years stockpiling resources for the temple long before Solomon ever lifted a tool. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, timber, all stored and waiting. Solomon began the temple with an enormous head start handed to him by his father. The palace had no such gift. Every scrap of it had to be gathered from scratch. Second, complexity. The temple served one sacred function. The palace served 5 distinct functions, each needing its own architecture, its own acoustics, its own security, its own everything. More complexity always means more time. Third, scale. 4 times the floor space means 4 times the stone to quarry, to move, to cut, to set. 4 times the coordination, 4 times the problems to solve. 13 years is not spiritual laziness. It is arithmetic. But the deeper answer is the theological one. So ask yourself something honest. Does God need square footage? The most holy place, the most sacred room in the entire temple, measured 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. A perfect cube, roughly 30 feet in every direction. And inside that cube, 2 golden cherubim, the Ark of the Covenant, and the very presence of the Creator of the universe. One priest entered that space 1 time a year, alone with God. You do not build a stadium for that meeting. You do not need 5,000 square cubits for one man and the presence of the infinite. Sacred space is not measured in floor area. It is measured in holiness. But the headquarters of an empire is a different matter entirely. It has to store 300 shields. It has to secure the wealth of a whole nation. It has to hold a throne room for handing down judgment. It has to seat delegations from Egypt and Phoenicia and Sheba. It has to house the royal family and all their household. Different purposes demand different buildings. A hospital is not built like a home. A factory is not built like a chapel. Solomon understood something we keep forgetting. Sacred and administrative are not rivals. They are simply different jobs, and they need different rooms. So if the engineering makes sense, and the theology makes sense, then what exactly have we been getting wrong all this time? And here is where it finally breaks open. For 3,000 years, we have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking why Solomon's palace was bigger than God's temple, as if bigger means more important, as if square footage measures love, as if the king who once asked for wisdom instead of riches would suddenly lose every ounce of that wisdom the moment he started laying foundation stones. The right question is this: what does the size of each building reveal about its purpose? The temple was small because holiness is intimate. Think about what actually happened in that space. The most holy place, the most sacred spot on the face of the earth, was a cube about 30 feet on each side. Inside it, 2 cherubim with their wings spread wide. The ark holding the tablets of the law. The mercy seat where the presence of God came to rest. One priest, one time a year, alone with the Almighty. You do not need 5,000 square cubits for that. You need purity. You need reverence. You need to fall on your face in awe. The temple's small size was making a declaration. God does not need room. He asks for your whole heart instead. The palace was massive because governing is complicated. An armory needs volume for 300 golden shields. A treasury needs security for the wealth of a kingdom. A throne room needs acoustics for words that decide who lives and who dies. Diplomatic halls need space for envoys from the greatest nations of the age. Solomon did not build bigger because he loved himself more than he loved God. He built bigger because running an empire takes more square footage than hosting the presence of the divine. The palace was making its own declaration. Human government takes room. Communion with God takes a heart laid bare. This is the wisdom of Solomon that we somehow walked right past. He understood something profound about faith and about ordinary life. The sacred and the ordinary are not enemies fighting over the same ground. They are 2 halves of one faithful existence. The temple pointed upward, humanity reaching toward God in worship. The palace spread outward, the wisdom of God flowing down into human government, into justice, into provision, into protection. Both were necessary. Both were holy in their own purpose. Both rose from the same Jerusalem limestone, shaped by the same hands, paid for from the same treasury, dedicated to the same God. You do not measure devotion by floor space. You measure it by whether each room, large or small, does the work God gave it to do. The wisest king who ever lived built 2 great structures in one city. One small and intimate, made for meeting God. One vast and complex, made for serving God's people. And here's the thing. Both of them were exactly the right size. Solomon's palace was never only stone and cedar. It was a sermon written in architecture. The God who lives in quiet, hidden mystery also rules over the loud, sprawling complexity of human life. Every courtroom, every treasury, every waiting room and throne room, all of it under one sovereign hand. Maybe that is why Solomon could later write those famous words. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. All your ways, the sacred and the ordinary, the temple and the palace, the prayer closet and the workplace. Both matter. Both demand wisdom. Both can bring glory to God. So here's what stays with me. We spend so much energy trying to keep faith in one room and the rest of life in another. We treat Sunday as sacred and Monday as something less. But Solomon, with all his wisdom, built both houses out of the same stone, on the same hill, for the same God. He never split his life into the holy part and the leftover part. He let one wisdom shape all of it. And maybe that is the truth we have been missing in all our arguing about square footage. The question was never whether God deserved a bigger house. The question is whether we will let his wisdom into every room of ours. So what surprised you the most? Was it the 50-ton foundation stones dragged uphill without a single machine? Was it the air conditioning designed 3,000 years before we gave it a name? Or was it the real reason behind the difference in size? The reason hiding in the stone all along? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them. And if something here made you see an old story in a new light, subscribe and tap the bell so the next one finds you. Thank you for being here. And remember this. Every stone in Solomon's Jerusalem, the great ones and the small ones, was set in place with purpose. So is every part of your life.